You know, Barb said that our learning theme is blessings this month, and I just listened to that and I think what a blessing it is to work and serve this church with you, Chris and Katie. Absolutely. In our reading this morning, Elizabeth Gwynn said, "What matters is that we are willing to live our lives in the shape of what is being asked, not hope that what we are being asked to do fits the shape of our lives." Now, I don't know about you, but I like that sentiment, but it can be a really hard thing to actually do sometimes. Constantly being aware, educated, and engaged with all that is happening in the world around us, well, sometimes it can just leave us exhausted and overwhelmed. That's when we need to find ways to recharge our batteries, to clear out our minds and get back into balance. Now, some of us in this church community do that through meditative practices. Some of us go out for walks in the wood. Some of us play with our children or our puppies. Some of us like to get outside and work in our gardens. One of the ways that I find works for me to recenter my spirit and refresh my mind is to pull out my season pass and to head over to Kentucky Kingdom to go for a ride or two on the Lightning Run or the Storm Chaser roller coaster. Last summer, this was a twice-a-week spiritual practice for me. And I will tell you, it really helped in the adjustment, making the adjustment into life here in Louisville and becoming your new minister here at All Peoples. It made it easier, gave me a lot of good energy to make it enjoyable. On one particular Wednesday afternoon last August, while I was in line to ride the Storm Chaser for the third time of the day, I started up a conversation with an older man in line right in front of me. This man was wearing a hat with a logo on it of the American Coaster Enthusiast Club. Now, I have been a member of ACE, as we call it, for a long time, but I didn't have a hat to show for it. Well, it turns out that this guy was passing through Kentucky on his way home to North Carolina, and he decided to stop by Kentucky Kingdom to ride some of the roller coasters he'd read about. Well, I told him that I had recently moved here to the area to take a new position as the minister of a local church. He naturally asked me, "Well, what kind of church are you serving?" And I proudly told him that I was a Unitarian Universalist. With a puzzled look, he said, "Unitarian Universalist? What's that?" Now, I am sure that you've had this happen to you. And I'm sure that when it does, you are ready and you are prepared with a solid answer on the spot. Aren't you right? Well, of course, there are many different ways to explain our church and what we are all about. On this particular day, with this particular person, I chose to explain Unitarian Universalism by talking about some of the activities that we have here. I mentioned our adult exploration classes and our Sunday morning discussion group. And I talked about how we teach our children about a wide variety of world religions and host educational programs about everything from the climate crisis to reproductive justice. This man listened, and he said to me, you know, that sounds more like a university than it does a church. Now, the conversation went on, and I explained our embrace of multiple theological perspectives and a little bit about our Unitarian Universalist principles and values, and I told him about our work for social justice. I think by the time that it was our turn to ride the Storm Chaser, this man had at least a little more understanding about our unconventional approach to being a religious community. But what I remember most out of that interaction was his initial response. That sounds more like a university than it does a church. Now, perhaps that is not necessarily a bad reaction to get. After all, one of our core principles as Unitarian Universalists is that we encourage spiritual growth, and we promote the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This church is a place where we come for comfort and hope in challenging times. It is a community of connections and friends and good food. It is a gathering place where we join with others to be a loud voice for fairness and change and do more good in the world than we could ever do alone. But most of all, this church is a place of learning. It is a community of people with curious minds and open hearts. Now, why is learning so important to us? In one of the traditional UU covenants found in the back of our gray hymnal and said aloud in many of our congregations across the country, there is a line that reads, "The quest of truth is our sacrament." Now think about that. Now, other churches have sacraments, things like bread and wine, baptism, and confession. These are rituals that are practices that are believed to bring people in those communities closer to true relationship with their God. So why would we call learning and seeking knowledge our Unitarian Universalist sacrament? Well, I think that's because it is an expression of one of the most basic qualities of our faith. And that is our belief that ultimate truth and religious revelation are never complete, never unalterably written in stone. Our quest to understand ourselves and others and this amazing world which surrounds us is and always will be a work in progress. Thus, there is always more truth to be found if and when we keep looking for it. For us as Unitarian Universalists, if we want to find God or goodness or meaning or wisdom, we know that we need to open up a book, engage in a conversation, share a story, and listen to other people's experiences. Learning is, in and of itself, a spiritual practice. It is the work of our lives, and we are blessed to be able to do a whole lot of it here together. Today I want to explore with you a little bit about what our search for truth and meaning actually looks like and feels like, and perhaps to uncover some assumptions we make that could be limiting us or holding us back. I have been recently reading a biography of a woman named Sophia Lyon-Fahs. Her name may be familiar to some of you. Sophie Fahs is considered by many to be one of the most important people in the history of Unitarian Universalism. She grew up the daughter of two Christian missionaries and lived for part of her childhood in China in the late 1800s. When Sophie grew up, she went to school to become a Christian teacher. After her 3 children were born, she did not give up her career like many women during that time, but she kept teaching Sunday school and continued her own religious studies. Being a mother taught Sophia many things, and it changed her ideas about religion, and especially her ways of teaching religion. The models of learning at most churches during that era were based on the idea that children's minds were like empty jars, and education was the process of filling up those jars with information. But Sophia Fahs chose to take a different approach. The biography of her put it this way: instead of empty jars, Sophia thought children were like gardens, already planted with seeds of possibility for learning and growing. She decided that a teacher's job was to provide the good soil and water and sunlight a garden needs to grow. So rather than making Sunday school lessons that just passed on information about the Bible and the church's history and rituals, she created classes where children could ask questions, share their experiences and thoughts, do activities, and grow from within. Sophia Foss brought her wisdom about learning to our Unitarian Universalist tradition and created religious education curriculums that were used in our churches for well over half a century. She later became a UU minister herself at the age of 82, proving that you are never too old to explore new ideas. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about learning, I imagine it's simply to be that process of getting more information, of knowing more facts, of gathering up additional data and details so that I can better understand what's happening around me. But when I really examine my life, my thoughts, and my deeper sense of self, it becomes clear that the most important learning involves much more. The cultivation of knowledge and wisdom, the search for truth and meaning, the quest for the inspiration that I need to connect what I know and how I act and what I do, requires much more than just careful study of statistics and details. It most often comes from experience and from relationship. My most profound learning seems to happen when some new information or some new experience or even new person challenges my assumptions or my perspective, and I am compelled to change my mind or change my heart. I had such a moment of learning several years ago when I first heard the words of the young Swedish environmental activist Greta Thunberg. Watching Greta's emotional pleas to world leaders on the news, I was not only touched by what she had to say, I was very touched by her anger. Her anger over the denial and the lack of action that are dooming her generation to live in a more hostile and unlivable world. What changed for me, what became more clear after hearing Greta and reading her book that's titled "No One is Too Small to Make a Difference," what changed was a new way of not only understanding, but also feeling what is happening to our planet. Our climate crisis is not about finding technical and scientific solutions. It is about justice. Refusing to take bold actions and alter the way that we live today is a form of oppression. Ignoring and suppressing the lives of those who are not yet born in order to maintain our own comfort and prosperity. And thus, the climate crisis is a battle for justice, and one that which none of us can remain neutral. Another example of this transformative learning that is happening for me right now involves conversations that I have been having with our church staff here at All Peoples about the idea of accountability. The proposed 8th principle statement that we are going to be considering adopting later this year as a congregation calls us to, and I quote, "take actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." Now, I think for many of us, the word accountability has connotations of judgment and maybe even punishment for failing to do something. It leads us to imagine that someone is going to have to be put in charge of deciding if we are fulfilling our promises and living our values appropriately or not. It implies consequences for making mistakes. But what I am coming to understand through some lively and often engaging discussions with our Justice Center Director, Russ Funk, and others, is that being accountable simply means that we take our commitments seriously and that we are willing and able to look at ourselves and our attitudes and our actions and reflect on them with intention. Being accountable means that we have a responsibility to support and encourage one another, celebrating together the moments when we have risen to the occasion, and also sharing in the struggles to do better, to be better, to cultivate positive models of change. Accountability pushes us to see that racism and sexism and other biases are not just issues that affect the most vulnerable to them. They are personal afflictions that weigh down our hearts and our spirits. And getting past them is not just about having better information. It requires a change of heart. Whether we are learning about the culture and the language and the religious beliefs of people who come from other parts of our world, or we are studying the history of our own Unitarian Universalist tradition, our search for truth and meaning cannot just be about gaining more knowledge. It has to change our attitudes, our perspectives. It has to change our actions and transform our hearts. Real learning requires that we have the humility to let go of what we think we know and be open to new ways of being. It often involves that most difficult process of unlearning old ideas that perpetuate our problems and relearning from sources of wisdom that we may have never even considered. Sophia Foz, that great voice of religious education from our past, once wrote this: "All life is religious when we learn to experience it that way. When some new light is seen, when some deeper appreciation is felt, when some larger outlook is gained, when some nobler purpose is formed, when we go high and wide and deep, then we are learning, and then we are living our religion." As we go forth today on this blessed search for truth and meaning that we get to share, as we buckle up for the roller coaster ride that life will inevitably bring our way this week, may we seek out those simple and sacred moments of learning, those transformational times when we suddenly say to ourselves, "Hey, I never thought about it that way." And may we let them surround us and renew us and inspire us. May we let them change our hearts, and may we share them with others. So may it be, and amen.